When I look back, the first thing I notice is how quiet the mornings have become. It used to be chaotic, Lily yelling about finding her favorite hairband, Ethan shoving cereal into his mouth like he had an early meeting with the president, and Julia humming as she got ready for work. I'd sit at the breakfast table, coffee in hand, smiling at the buzz of it all. It wasn't perfect, but it was my life. My perfect life, or so I thought. I never imagined that beneath all that noise, there was a quiet lie threading itself through my days. Julia and I had been married for 12 years. 12. That's a long time to love someone, to trust them, to share everything. We met at a 4th of July barbecue. I was the guy fumbling with a propane grill, and she was the gorgeous brunette laughing at my incompetence. That laugh hooked me. It was effortless, genuine. We were married 2 years later, and not long after, Ethan was born. I still remember the first time I held him, the weight of his tiny body in my arms, the way his cries silenced the noise in my head. When Lily came along 3 years later, it felt like we were solidifying our place in the universe. The Thomas family. 2 kids, a dog named Max, and a mortgage on a house that backed up to a forest we pretended was our own little slice of heaven. If you had asked me back then, I would have told you Julia was my soulmate. The first crack appeared late one night, a Tuesday, if I remember right. Julia was on the phone in the kitchen. She spoke in hushed tones, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but something about the way she spoke caught my attention. It was the tone. You know the tone, like someone's sharing a secret they have no intention of letting you hear. No, not tonight, he's still awake. I froze in the hallway. Yeah, I'll let you know, she said, her voice soft but firm. When she hung up, I stepped into the kitchen, pretending I was grabbing water. Who was that? I asked casually, opening the fridge. Julia barely looked up. Work stuff. You know how it is. She was a marketing manager for a mid-sized company. She worked long hours, always juggling campaigns and client meetings. It wasn't unusual for her to take late-night calls. But something about the way she avoided eye contact made my stomach twist. Work stuff at 11 o'clock. I pressed. She smiled, a bit too wide. Yeah, Mark. Some people have deadlines. I didn't push further. Maybe I should have, but at the time, I told myself it was nothing. Just a phone call. Just work. But then there were other things. Small things. She started working out more, obsessively, almost. Julia had always been active, but now she was going to the gym 5 times a week, sometimes twice a day. She bought new clothes that didn't seem like her. Expensive perfumes. She changed her hairstyle, something softer, sexier. I noticed it all, but I didn't say anything. What was I supposed to say? Hey, you look great, are you cheating on me? Instead, I kept quiet and let the doubts fester. The tipping point came 3 weeks later. I was cleaning out the trunk of her car when I found a receipt tucked under the floor mat. It was from a restaurant, a fancy one downtown. Dinner for 2. I felt the air leave my lungs. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had a work meeting. Maybe she took a client out. But deep down, I knew. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Julia slept beside me. I kept picturing her at that restaurant, laughing, smiling, looking at someone the way she used to look at me. For the first time in 12 years, I didn't kiss her goodnight. The next morning, Ethan ran into the kitchen, waving a crumpled piece of paper. Dad! Look! I drew you. He handed me the paper, and I couldn't help but smile. It was a stick figure with brown hair, a big grin, and arms that looked like noodles. This is me? I asked, ruffling his hair. Yeah. And that's you and Mom and Lily. We're at the park. I looked at the drawing again, my chest tightening. Ethan and Lily were my world. No matter what was going on with Julia, I had them. That thought comforted me. At least, it did then. But in the back of my mind, the doubts about Julia lingered. By the time I left for work that day, I had already decided. I couldn't let this go. Something wasn't right, and I needed to know the truth. I was never the jealous type. At least, that's what I told myself. Julia and I had built a relationship on trust, or so I thought. But after that night, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. The phone call. The receipt. The way she seemed so detached. I started noticing things I'd never noticed before. Julia had always been a bit of a perfectionist, but now it felt different. She was on edge, snapping at me for the smallest things. If I asked how her day went, she'd give me a short, vague answer, like she was in a hurry to get the conversation over with. One Saturday, she said she was heading out to meet some girlfriends for brunch. That wasn't unusual, she had a close-knit group of friends she'd known since college. But something about the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced the line in front of a mirror. "Which friends?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She blinked, her smile faltering for just a second. "Oh, you don't know them. Some coworkers." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but my mind was already racing. Julia never hung out with coworkers outside of office events. That afternoon, I called Nate, my best friend since high school. Nate wasn't the kind of guy to sugarcoat things, which is why I trusted him. "Hey," I said when he picked up. "You got a minute?" "Always." "What's up?" I hesitated. Saying it out loud felt real. "I think Julia's hiding something." There was a pause on the other end. "Hiding something like what?" "Like, I don't know. Maybe she's cheating on me." Nate exhaled sharply. "Man, that's a hell of a thing to say." "You sure?" "No. That's the problem. I don't have any proof, just gut feelings." "Well, guts don't lie, bro. Look, I hate to bring this up, but you've heard the rumors, right?" My stomach dropped. "What rumors?" Nate hesitated, and I could practically hear him debating whether to tell me. "Come on, man," I pressed. "Spit it out." "I heard she's been friendly with some guy from her work. Ryan something. But it's probably just office gossip, you know." I clenched my jaw. Ryan. The name felt like a punch to the gut. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I demanded. "Because I didn't want to stir the pot unless I was sure it mattered," Nate said. "Look, maybe it's nothing. But if it's eating you up, you gotta find out. Don't sit on this." I thanked him and hung up, my mind spinning. Ryan. That evening, Julia came home later than usual. She looked flushed, like she'd been running, but there was no gym bag in sight. "Tough workout?" I asked as she walked past me. She paused, giving me a tight smile. "Yeah. Exhausting." She headed upstairs without another word. The next few days were torture. I felt like I was living in a bad crime drama, piecing together clues that only made me feel worse. I checked her phone when she left it on the counter, but there was nothing suspicious, just a lot of work emails and texts from her friends. Still, something didn't sit right. Then I found the second receipt. It was in her coat pocket, and this one wasn't for a restaurant. It was for a hotel. I stared at it for what felt like hours, my heart pounding so hard it felt like my ribs might crack. The date on the receipt was from last month, a day she had told me she was working late. My hands shook as I put the receipt back where I found it. By the weekend, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I sat Julia down at the dining table after the kids went to bed. She looked tired, but there was something else in her eyes, something guarded. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady. She raised an eyebrow. Okay. About what? About you. About us. Julia crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair. Mark, what's going on? You've been acting weird lately. I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. I could ask you the same thing. She frowned. What's that supposed to mean? You've been distant, I said. You're out all the time, and when you're here, it feels like you're not really here. I found a hotel receipt in your coat pocket, Julia. A hotel. Her face went pale, but she recovered quickly. Too quickly. That's for work, she said, her tone defensive. We had an out-of-town client meeting. Really? Because it was for a hotel 10 minutes from your office. Her jaw tightened. What are you accusing me of? I don't know, I said. You tell me. Julia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. I can't believe you're spying on me. Don't turn this around on me, I said, my voice rising. Just tell me the truth, Julia. She stared at me for a long moment, her chest rising and falling as she took deep breaths. Then she turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind her. That night, I made the call. The private investigator was a guy named Dan. Middle-aged, gruff, and straight to the point. He didn't ask too many questions, he just took the details and told me he'd be in touch. The next few weeks were a blur of anxiety. Every time Julia left the house, I felt a mix of anger and dread. When Dan finally called, his voice was calm, almost clinical. I've got something you'll want to see, he said. I met him at a coffee shop downtown. He slid a manila envelope across the table, and when I opened it, my worst fears were confirmed. There were photos of Julia with a man I assumed was Ryan. They were leaving a restaurant, laughing together. Another photo showed them entering a hotel. But the photo that broke me was the one of them at the park. Our park, Ryan was pushing Lily on a swing, and Julia was holding Ethan's hand, smiling like she didn't have a care in the world. My hands trembled as I closed the envelope. Are you okay? Dan asked. No, I said quietly. But thanks for your help. I left the coffee shop in a daze, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. But the worst was yet to come. I stared at the manila envelope on my desk like it was a loaded gun. I hadn't opened it again since leaving the coffee shop, but the images were burned into my mind, Julia and Ryan, the man I'd never met but now couldn't stop thinking about. The kids were upstairs playing video games, their laughter carrying through the house, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. I sat there, grappling with what to do next. Should I confront Julia? Should I leave? I felt like my life had been torn apart, and yet, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan and Lily. They were my world. But were they really mine? The thought hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just a fleeting doubt, it was a question I couldn't shake. I had always been there for them, always loved them unconditionally. But now, everything felt like a lie. I didn't want to know. But at the same time, I had to know. 2 days later, I found myself in a sterile, white-walled lab at a DNA testing facility. The technician handed me 2 kits, one for Ethan, one for Lily, and explained the process. He spoke in a calm, measured tone, like he wasn't holding my entire life in his hands. Back home, I waited until Julia was out of the house. She'd said she was meeting friends again, but I didn't even bother asking who. Hey, kids, I said, forcing a smile. Want to help me with a fun science experiment? They were immediately excited, asking a million questions about what we were doing. I told them it was for a school project, something about genetics and family trees. It wasn't far from the truth, I guess. Ethan went first, swabbing the inside of his cheek and handing me the stick with a proud grin. Lily followed, giggling when the swab tickled her mouth. I sealed the kits, thanked them for being my little scientists, and sent them back to their video games. That night, as I dropped the package into the mailbox, my hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. The results came back a week later. I had barely slept in days, my mind racing with every possible outcome. But when I saw the envelope in the mailbox, I almost didn't open it. Back inside, I locked myself in my office, sitting at my desk with the envelope in my hands. My heart pounded as I tore it open, pulling out the neatly typed report. I scanned the document, my eyes locking on the key line. Probability of paternity, 0%. Twice. First for Ethan. Then for Lily. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands went numb, the paper trembling as I held it. I read it again and again, hoping I'd somehow misread it. But the words didn't change. They were as cold and unfeeling as the betrayal they confirmed. Neither of them were mine. That evening, I waited for Julia in the living room. The kids were asleep, and the house was eerily quiet. When she walked through the door, she looked surprised to see me sitting there. "Hey," she said cautiously. "What's going on?" "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but low. She hesitated, then sat down across from me, her eyes scanning my face. "Okay. What about?" I reached behind me and pulled out the manila envelope, tossing it onto the coffee table. "What's this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Open it," I said. Julia hesitated, then picked up the envelope. She pulled out the photos, her face blanching as she flipped through them. "Mark, I can explain." "Don't," I said, cutting her off. "Don't insult me with excuses." She set the photos down, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sorry?" I repeated, my voice rising. "That's all you have to say? You've been lying to me for years, Julia. Years. And not just about him. Ethan and Lily, they're not mine, are they?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely shocked. "How did you?" "I had a DNA test done," I said, my voice breaking. "They're not mine." Julia burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. "Mark, please. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't." "You didn't mean to what? To cheat on me? To have another man's children and let me raise them as my own? Which part of this wasn't intentional, Julia?" She sobbed harder, shaking her head. "It wasn't like that. Ryan and I. It started years ago, but it didn't mean anything. I love you, Mark. I swear I do." I laughed bitterly. "You love me? That's rich. Do you even know what love is?" She reached out to me, but I recoiled. "Please," she begged. "Let me explain." I stood, pacing the room as my emotions boiled over. "Explain what?" "That you've been lying to me for over a decade? That you've let me believe Ethan and Lily were my kids while you played house with him?" Her sobs quieted, and she looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said weakly. "You didn't know how to tell me?" I repeated, my voice dripping with venom. "You didn't want to tell me. You wanted to keep your perfect little lie intact." We sat in silence for what felt like hours. Finally, I looked at her, my voice hollow. "I want you out of this house," I said. She stared at me, her mouth opening to protest. "But tomorrow," I said, cutting her off. "You pack your things, and you go. I'll figure out the rest." "Mark, please," she said, her voice breaking. "The kids." I shook my head, my eyes stinging with tears. "Don't. Don't you dare use them as an excuse." Julia buried her face in her hands again, sobbing quietly. I walked out of the room, my chest heaving with a mix of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. Upstairs, I peeked into Ethan and Lily's room. They were fast asleep, their faces peaceful. They weren't mine. But God help me, I still loved them. The morning after our confrontation, the house felt like a tomb. The sunlight filtering through the blinds did nothing to soften the suffocating silence. Julia avoided me, staying upstairs as much as she could. The kids, sensing the tension, kept to themselves. I sat at the kitchen table nursing a cold cup of coffee, staring at the list I'd started writing on a yellow legal pad, * call lawyer. Change bank passwords. Pack her things, * my hands hovered over the pen, but the words blurred together. I wasn't ready to face it. At around 10 a.m., Julia finally came downstairs. She was dressed in jeans and a loose sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept. Good. Neither had I. I'm taking the kids to my mom's for the day, she said softly, not meeting my eyes. I looked up from the table, my jaw tightening. Does she know about all this? Julia's lips trembled, but she didn't answer. Of course, she doesn't, I said bitterly. Wouldn't want anyone else to know what you've done, right? Mark, please, she said, her voice breaking. I just need some time to think. The kids do too. They don't know yet, I said firmly. Her eyes widened. You didn't tell them? I shook my head, my chest tightening. Not yet. But I will. They deserve to know the truth, Julia. All of it. Her face crumpled, and she sank into the chair across from me. Mark, please don't. They're just kids. They don't need to know about this. I leaned forward, my voice low but sharp. They're my kids. Or at least, I thought they were. You've taken away my right to be their father in every sense of the word. So don't tell me what they don't need to know. Julia left with Ethan and Lily an hour later. Watching her car pull out of the driveway felt like watching my life unravel in slow motion. As the day stretched on, I forced myself to focus. I called a lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Claire who listened patiently as I stumbled through an explanation of the situation. We'll start with divorce proceedings, she said. You've got grounds for infidelity, but custody is going to be tricky. Custody? I echoed, stunned. Yes, she said gently. Biologically, they aren't yours. That doesn't mean you can't fight for visitation or even shared custody, but it complicates things. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. So, what? I just lose them because she lied to me? It's not that simple, Claire said. Judges take emotional bonds into account, especially if you've been a consistent presence in their lives. But this isn't a slam dunk, Mark. It's going to be a fight. I thanked her and hung up, feeling more lost than ever. Julia and the kids didn't come home until after dark. I heard the front door open and close, followed by the soft patter of their footsteps upstairs. When Julia came back down, I was waiting for her in the living room. We need to talk, I said, motioning for her to sit. She hesitated but finally sat down on the couch opposite me. I spoke to a lawyer today, I began, watching her face carefully. Her eyes flickered with fear. Mark, please don't do this. We can work through this. For the kids. For the kids. I repeated, my voice rising. Don't you dare use them as a shield, Julia. You've already taken so much from me, don't make this about them. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let up. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. I'm filing for divorce. I'm also going to fight for custody of Ethan and Lily. She gasped. You can't. Mark, they're not biologically. I don't care, I snapped. I've been their father since the day they were born. I'm not walking away from them just because of your lies. Julia broke down, her sobs echoing through the room. I didn't mean for it to be this way, she cried. I was scared, Mark. When I found out I was pregnant with Ethan, I didn't know what to do. Ryan wasn't ready to be a father, and you were so good to me. I thought it would be easier if you never knew. Easier for who? I demanded. You. Ryan. What about me, Julia? What about the kids? Did you ever stop to think about what this would do to them? She shook her head, her face crumpling. I didn't think it would ever come to this. Well, it has, I said, standing up. You've destroyed everything, Julia. Everything. The next day, I sat Ethan and Lily down in the living room. My hands shook as I explained, in the simplest terms I could, that their mom and I wouldn't be living together anymore. But why? Ethan asked, his big blue eyes filling with tears. Did we do something wrong? No, buddy, I said, pulling him into a hug. You didn't do anything wrong. This isn't about you or Lily. It's about me and Mom. Sometimes, grown-ups have problems they can't fix. Lily sniffled, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Will we still see you? I felt a lump rise in my throat. Of course you will, I said, my voice trembling. I'm still your dad. That's never going to change. Their tears broke me, but I held them close, promising myself that no matter what happened, I'd fight for them. That night, Julia moved into her mother's house. Watching her drive away for the second time felt like ripping a band-aid off a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. The house was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't peaceful. It was empty. I stood in the doorway of Ethan and Lily's room, staring at their drawings taped to the walls, their toys scattered across the floor. They weren't mine. But they were still mine. I didn't know how I was going to move forward, but I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't giving up on them. The days that followed felt like a fog. I woke up every morning expecting to hear Ethan and Lily's voices, their laughter echoing through the house. Instead, I was greeted by silence. The emptiness was suffocating. Julia was staying with her mother, and the kids were with her. I hadn't seen them since they left, and every hour without them felt like an eternity. It wasn't long before the paperwork began piling up. Claire, my lawyer, was relentless. She kept me grounded, outlining every step of the divorce process with cold precision. Custody is going to be our biggest hurdle, she said during one of our meetings. You've been their father in every way that matters, but Julia could argue that biological ties give her and Ryan the upper hand. My stomach churned at the mention of his name. Ryan. The man who had stolen my family without even trying. What are my chances? I asked. Claire leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. It depends on how hard you're willing to fight. Judges favor stability, and you've been their primary caregiver for years. But if Ryan decides to step in and claim his rights, things could get messy. I clenched my fists under the table. I don't care how messy it gets. I'm not losing them. The first court hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later. In the meantime, I had visitation rights. Seeing the kids again for the first time since they left was both a relief and a heartbreak. Ethan ran to me as soon as he saw me, throwing his arms around my waist. Dad, he cried, his voice muffled against my shirt. Lily followed close behind, clutching her stuffed rabbit. I missed you, she whispered, her big eyes filling with tears. I crouched down, pulling them both into a tight hug. I missed you too, I said, my voice cracking. Julia hovered nearby, watching us with a mixture of guilt and sadness. I ignored her, focusing on the kids. We spent the day at the park, playing on the swings and eating ice cream. For a few precious hours, it felt like everything was normal. But as the day wore on, reality crept back in. Dad, Ethan said as we sat on a bench, his voice hesitant. Yeah, buddy. Why can't you and Mom just fix things? I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. Sometimes, no matter how much two people want to fix something, they can't, I said. But that doesn't mean we don't love you and Lily. That will never change. He nodded, though I could see the confusion and hurt in his eyes. Lily climbed onto my lap, clutching her rabbit tightly. "Are you mad at us?" she asked softly. I hugged her close, my heart breaking. "Never," I said. "This isn't your fault. It's not about you. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." They didn't ask any more questions after that, but the weight of their silence was heavy. Back at home, I threw myself into preparing for the custody battle. I gathered photos, school records, and testimonials from friends and neighbors who could vouch for my role in the kids' lives. Claire was relentless, coaching me on how to present my case in court. "The judge needs to see that you're committed to these kids, no matter what," she said. "Show them your love, your stability, your willingness to put the children first." "Isn't that obvious?" I asked. "Not in court," she said bluntly. "You have to prove it." The hearing was grueling. Julia sat across from me, her lawyer making her case for sole custody. They argued that Ryan, as the biological father, had a right to be involved in the kids' lives. Ryan wasn't in the courtroom, but his shadow loomed over every word. When it was my turn to speak, I poured my heart out. I talked about Ethan and Lily's first steps, their first words, the nights I stayed up with them when they were sick. "I may not share their DNA," I said, my voice trembling. "But I've been their dad every single day of their lives. That doesn't change because of a piece of paper. They're my kids, and I love them more than anything in this world." I caught Julia's gaze as I spoke. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly looked away. The judge didn't make a decision that day. The waiting was unbearable. Every day felt like an eternity as I wondered whether I'd lose the two people who meant the most to me. Then, finally, the ruling came. Joint custody. The relief was overwhelming. I would still have a role in Ethan and Lily's lives. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The months that followed were a blur of adjustments. Ethan and Lily split their time between my house and Julia's. It was hard at first, every time they left, the house felt empty again. But I cherished every moment I had with them. Ryan never stepped forward to claim a role in their lives. Part of me was grateful for that, but another part of me burned with anger at his cowardice. He had caused so much damage, yet he wasn't the one picking up the pieces. Julia and I maintained a fragile truce for the sake of the kids. We spoke only when necessary, keeping things civil but distant. One night, as I tucked Ethan into bed, he looked up at me with a serious expression. "Dad," he said. "Yeah, buddy. You'll always be my dad, right? No matter what." Tears filled my eyes as I leaned down and kissed his forehead. "Always," I said. Lily peeked her head into the room, clutching her rabbit. "Me too." "Both of you," I said, pulling her into a hug. "Always." As I held them close, I realized something important. Being a father wasn't about DNA. It was about love, sacrifice, and showing up every single day. They were my kids. And nothing, not Julia, not Ryan, not a piece of paper, could ever take that away from me. The first few weeks of shared custody were harder than I expected. The house felt like a carousel of emotions, joy when Ethan and Lily were with me, followed by crushing loneliness when they weren't. Every time I dropped them off at Julia's, I felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind. But I made a decision early on, I wasn't going to let bitterness define me. Not for them, not for myself. Work became my sanctuary. I poured myself into projects at the architectural firm where I'd been a senior designer for years. My colleagues noticed the change. "Man, you're killing it with these designs lately," my boss, Greg, said one afternoon as he reviewed my latest proposal. "Everything okay at home?" I hesitated. "Not exactly. But I'm working on it." Greg nodded knowingly. "If you ever need time or someone to talk to, let me know. Life's too short to carry all that weight alone." His words stuck with me. Therapy wasn't something I ever thought I'd do, but Claire suggested it during one of our meetings. It's not just about you, she said. The kids are going through this too, and they'll need you to be their rock. So, I booked an appointment. Dr. Hayes was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a knack for making you talk even when you didn't want to. At first, I was hesitant, answering her questions with short, clipped responses. But over time, the sessions became a lifeline. I don't know how to move past this, I admitted during one session. The betrayal, the lies, it's like a weight I can't put down. Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Forgiveness doesn't mean condoning what happened. It's about freeing yourself from the anger. Letting go of that weight. But how do I forgive someone who destroyed my life? I asked. She smiled gently. One day at a time. My relationship with Ethan and Lily became my anchor. I started new traditions with them, movie nights every Friday, pancake breakfasts on Saturdays, and long bike rides through the trails near our house. One day, as we were sitting on the couch watching a superhero movie, Ethan turned to me. Dad? Yeah, buddy. Do you think Spider-Man's real dad taught him how to swing from webs? I laughed, ruffling his hair. Probably not. But I bet the person who raised him taught him all the important stuff, like how to be brave and do the right thing. Ethan nodded, satisfied with my answer. But his words stayed with me long after the movie ended. One afternoon, while picking the kids up from Julia's, I found myself face to face with her mother, Susan. She was standing on the porch, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Mark, she said, her voice firm. Susan, I replied cautiously. She hesitated, then sighed. I just want to say. I'm sorry for what Julia did. You didn't deserve that. I blinked, caught off guard. Thank you. She nodded, her gaze softening. No matter what, you'll always be their dad. Don't ever doubt that. Her words brought a lump to my throat. I won't. Months turned into a year. The legal battles faded into memory, replaced by the routines of co-parenting. Julia and I maintained a polite distance, communicating only about the kids. Ryan never entered the picture, and I suspected he never would. One evening, as I was tucking Lily into bed, she handed me a drawing she'd made at school. It was a picture of our family, me, Ethan, Lily, and Julia, all holding hands. Do you like it? She asked, her eyes shining with pride. It's perfect, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Miss Carter says families are about love, not just who's in them, she said matter-of-factly. I smiled, kissing her forehead. Miss Carter's a smart lady. As I turned off the light and closed her door, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Life didn't go back to the way it was, but it did move forward. I rebuilt myself, piece by piece, learning to find joy in the small things, a quiet morning, a successful project, a hug from my kids. Forgiveness didn't come all at once, but it came. Not for Julia's sake, but for mine. I couldn't carry the weight of anger anymore. As for Ethan and Lily, they remained my greatest pride, my greatest joy. DNA be damned, they were my kids. Always.